Hey there guys, Kieran here from the Scene to Screen podcast, and in this episode I'm going to be talking about one of my favourite film directors of all time, Steven Spielberg, and somehow I've pieced together a ranking of my top 5 Spielberg movies, which, trust me, was way more difficult than you can even imagine. This is actually an episode that I've wanted to do since me and AJ started the podcast, but I wanted to wait until the time was right. So with Ready Player One, which is of course Spielberg's latest film now in cinemas, I figured it was finally the perfect time to discuss some of my favourite Spielberg movies. Before I jump into my rankings though, I quickly just want to talk about Spielberg because, like I said in the intro, he's one of my favourite filmmakers of all time, he's a personal hero of mine, and as someone who's always been more interested in the people behind the camera than the actors in front of it, Spielberg was a massive kind of figure in my life and my childhood. The best directors can capture our imaginations, they can take us on adventures, and Spielberg manages to do that for me every time. So this really was a kind of difficult challenge, but I managed to get the job done, and without any further kind of delay, let's get into my top 5 Steven Spielberg movies. And in my number 5 spot, I've got the shark movie that everyone seems to love, Jaws. I know a lot of people out there are probably wondering why Jaws is so low on this list, given the fact that it's usually regarded as Spielberg's greatest film, but to be honest, the film never really had the same impact on me as it did on pretty much everyone else. Don't get me wrong, I absolutely love Jaws, it's still in my top 5, and like I said, Spielberg is my favourite director, so the fact that it's in my top 5 is big praise for this film. I just personally don't connect with Jaws in the same way that I connect with some of the other films that you'll see on this list. What I do love about Jaws is that while it's a terrifying movie about a giant shark, the best thing about it is that it's actually a character-driven film. More than any other Spielberg film, I think Jaws is the most human, and the way that Spielberg centers the film around these characters is still the most impressive thing about Jaws as a film. If it were just about a giant shark and the characters were rubbish and you didn't care if the characters lived or died, the film wouldn't be remembered as one of the greatest cinematic offerings of all time. So yeah, Jaws is at my number 5 spot, which means it's time to move on to my number 4, and I think I'm going to shock you all again with this one because at my number 4 I've got Jurassic Park. Jurassic Park is one of those movies, kind of like Star Wars, where when you're a kid, even though you've not seen it, you know about it, you'll talk about it at school, and it's just kind of always been there from the moment you're born. It was definitely like that for me anyway, because even though I knew what Jurassic Park was when I was a kid, I didn't really watch it all of the way through until I was a little bit older, which is why it doesn't really hit me with the nostalgia in the same way that I know it does for a lot of other people, especially those of you out there that might have been lucky enough to see it in a cinema. And even though I didn't see it until I was a little bit older, Jurassic Park was still one of those movies that had a massive influence on me. I mean, you're never too old to be afraid of dinosaurs, and just the way that Spielberg constructed the film and filled it with wonder and amazement, but kept all of the scary elements, still impresses me today. And that first Jurassic Park movie is one of the films that I can go back and watch over and over and over again, not because it reminds me of my childhood, but because it's just an incredibly well made and enjoyable blockbuster. So yeah, Jurassic Park is at my number 4, and honestly I don't really see any film bumping it lower on the list for quite a while, at least no film on the horizon, except maybe that Indiana Jones movie that he's got cooking up in his head. So yeah, let's move on to my number 3, and at number 3 I've got Catch Me If You Can. Catch Me If You Can is easily one of Spielberg's most underrated films, and it definitely doesn't get nearly as much credit as it deserves, especially in some of these rankings. For me, this movie was one of the first Spielberg films I saw. I think I even saw it before some of his more classic films, like Jurassic Park and like Jaws, but even when I watched it as a kid, I knew that this was something special, and there's something about Catch Me If You Can that captures my imagination, and the fact that it's a true story is mind-boggling, especially when you look at some of the stuff that Frank Abagnale got away with. He pretended to be a pilot, he pretended to be a doctor, a lawyer, and then at the end of it all, he was redeemed and given a chance to make up for what he did. I mean, a story really couldn't write itself any better than that, and I think the reason I love Catch Me If You Can so much is because Spielberg managed to make the film where there was no real bad guys. You didn't see Frank as a bad guy, you sympathised with him, and you wanted him to get away. Spielberg did a great job of showing you that this is just a kid who ran away when he was really young, and he just kind of kept digging himself a bigger hole that he desperately wants to get out of. And Leonardo DiCaprio played that role perfectly. And then on the other hand, you've got Tom Hanks as the FBI agent tracking Frank down, and Spielberg didn't make him the villain either. In a way, you were hoping that Frank would get away and wouldn't get caught, but at the same time, you kind of wanted him to get caught because Spielberg made you root for both of the characters, and that's something that I've only ever really seen in Catch Me If You Can. So yeah, Catch Me If You Can is my third favourite Spielberg movie, and that means I'm just going to jump straight into my number 2, and at number 2 I've got E.T. While it's not my favourite Spielberg movie, I think it's fair to say that E.T. is the most significant movie in Spielberg's filmography. If you walk down the street and ask 10 random strangers what their favourite Spielberg film is, I guarantee that most of them will say E.T. Just because when you think of Spielberg, you think of E.T. That's just the way it is, and even more than that, E.T. is just a fun, well-made film that not only gives us one of the greatest sci-fi stories of all time, but it also gives us one of the most emotional and human stories about a kid who's dealing with his parents' divorce and about an alien who's lost and just wants to go home. Even when I watch E.T. now, after many viewings, it still affects me in the same way as it did the first time I watched it. I still laugh, I still cry when you're meant to cry, and honestly, even though it's not at the number 1 spot on this list, I think if I was to sit a kid down and show them a Spielberg film, I would put on E.T. just because it's the ultimate kids film, and I do think E.T. is the Spielberg film that every kid should get a chance to see first. So that's it for my number 2 spot, which means it's finally time to reveal what my favourite Spielberg movie is, and in the number 1 spot, I've got Raiders of the Lost Ark. Raiders of the Lost Ark for me is the movie that I remember most from my childhood, and I'm gonna say something that you might have heard me say before, but in a lot of ways Raiders of the Lost Ark was my kind of Star Wars. I didn't watch Star Wars when I was a kid, so that was kind of my replacement for that franchise. And you know how like when you hear people that fell in love with cinema when they first watched Star Wars, or how Star Wars changed their life, I had that experience with this film, and honestly I don't think I would have gone to university to study film or even started this podcast if it wasn't for that movie. So maybe if time travel is ever created, my parents can go back and stop me from ever watching it. It's quite difficult to come up with reasons why I love this movie, just because it's kind of always been there. But more than anything else, I think it's because Raiders is just one of the most fun films ever created, and it introduces us to one of the greatest characters ever put on screen, which is of course Indiana Jones. This is the quintessential adventure film, and for me, I don't think any Spielberg movie will ever be able to affect me in the same way that Raiders does every time I watch it, which is quite often. So yeah, that's my number 1, and I guess that concludes my top 5 Spielberg movies. Thanks for listening to this episode of Scene to Screen. My review of Ready Player One is up now, so you can go and check that out, and please like this video, share it on social media. You can listen to the Scene to Screen podcast on iTunes, YouTube, SoundCloud and Stitcher, so make sure you check us out on your favourite platform and hit that subscribe button. What are your top 5 Steven Spielberg movies? Let us know in the comment section below, and again, thanks for listening. I hope I'll see you in the next episode.